up, guys? So today on the channel, I wanted to give you my thoughts on Zack Snyder's Justice League. I know a lot's already been said about this film, so I don't know if I'll be bringing anything new to the conversation, but as a film fan, it really is a one-of-a-kind anomaly in terms of how this film came to fruition, and I did think that was interesting to talk about because nothing like this has ever happened in the history of cinema before. A huge, big superhero blockbuster having an awful production, flopping, and then getting a second chance at life because of fan campaigns and petitions to hashtag release the Snyder Cut. And it's crazy that a studio actually caved to the demands of a fan base. So it is interesting, and I wanted to talk about it regardless. So let's talk about the Snyder Cut. Please do let me know your thoughts on the Snyder Cut in that comment section down below. Help my video out by hitting that thumbs up button. If you haven't done so already, click subscribe. So a brief bit of backstory on this film's troubled production. Back in 2016, Zack Snyder was working on his production of Justice League for Warner Brothers, and he shot most of it. He showed it to the executives and they said they wanted it to be funnier and also it couldn't be longer than 2 hours. So they brought in Joss Whedon to help tweak the script, make it more funny. However, when Zack Snyder's daughter tragically took her own life, Zack Snyder stepped away from the project and Joss Whedon took over directing duties. And apparently he added 80 pages of his own script to the story. So his version of Justice League was very different to what Zack Snyder and scriptwriter Chris Terrio had planned originally. The story was mostly the same, but it was very different in tone and style. Anyway, the 2017 theatrical version, or the Justice League as some have called it, was maligned by critics and bombed at the box office. I reviewed that film back when it came out. I'll pop a link up here if you guys want to check that out, but the short answer is I wasn't a fan of the Justice League cut. I thought it was a muddled mess of creative clashing visions. I thought it was ugly, overloaded with incomplete CGI, and the character development in that film was awful, particularly with Cyborg and Steppenwolf as the villain. I gave that film a 4.5 out of 10, which in retrospect I actually think was quite generous. Anyway, because the end product was so bad, a lot of DC and Zack Snyder fans started an online petition aimed at Warner Brothers to release the Snyder Cut. There was a lot of pushback from Warner Brothers. They were saying like, we can't do a Snyder Cut because the footage doesn't exist, which was a lie because they shot most of the movie before they brought in Joss Whedon. But then the stars of the film and the crew started coming forward publicly and supporting this social media movement of releasing the Snyder Cut. And a few years down the line, Warner Brothers finally reached a deal with Zack Snyder to let him finish his version of Justice League so they could release it on HBO Max. They even gave him an extra $70 million so he could finish off the CGI, the editing, and the score. So the fact that Snyder got to finish his version of Justice League is a cinematic miracle. Nothing like this has ever happened before, at least not on the same scale, because we have had director's cuts of big movies like Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, but this is almost like a complete do-over. Rather than adding or subtracting a few scenes, this is like stretching out a 2-hour film into a 4-hour film. It's this huge cinematic odyssey. And the fact that fan campaigning actually worked and seeing this huge movie studio caving to the demands of the fans does raise some interesting discussions about the future of cinema, because it's set a precedent now that if there's a demand from it from the fans, then maybe we can get other versions of other movies that we want to see. I've heard rumors that people are campaigning for an R-rated version of Mrs. Doubtfire, and part of me really does want to see that, because it'd be like getting one more final amazing performance out of Robin Williams, seeing a different version of Mrs. Doubtfire that we never got. And hey, if they're willing to give a huge multi-million-dollar superhero blockbuster a second chance of life, then a smaller, cheaper little film like Mrs. Doubtfire doesn't seem all that far-fetched, does it? But it is quite touching that after all the tragedy that fell upon Zack Snyder and his family, that he was allowed to come back to a passion project and see it through to completion. I tell you what though, guys, mark my words, someday there will be a movie about the making of this movie, or movies, I should say, because the journey to the Snyder Cut is like something from a novel or a graphic novel. It's the story about the making of this big, expensive, epic superhero movie which had a terrible production and was hit by personal tragedy for the director, who had to drop out of it. And then the film got made but was an epic fail. But through persistence and love and support from the fans, it got given a second chance and was reborn and ended up being redeemed. Now that's a story. I'll admit, I wasn't particularly excited for the Snyder Cut, partly because of how colossally disappointed I was with the first version, so I didn't think I was going to enjoy it. But the first reactions to this film were mostly positive, so I thought, okay, let's give it a chance. And I sat down, I watched all 4 hours of the Snyder Cut, albeit in 2 parts. I did have to watch it on 2 separate nights because this is a chunky movie. But despite my trepidations about the runtime and the fact that I really disliked the first version, I'm happy to report that the Snyder Cut is a vastly superior film in every single way. Is it a perfect film? Nope. I still have my fair share of issues with it, but I was pleasantly surprised by just how much I enjoyed this film in comparison to the version that we got back in 2017. It's more consistent in tone and style. The CGI, while still bombarding the film, is visibly better. And the characterization is way stronger, particularly with Ray Fisher's Cyborg. When you compare the 2 films side by side, the main thing that I took away from it is just how hugely different and satisfying Cyborg as a character is in Zack Snyder's version as opposed to Joss Whedon's version. Because he's just kind of there in the Joss Whedon cut, but in the Zack Snyder cut, he has an origin story, he has an arc, he's more interesting, he has a better dynamic with the other Justice League players. Also, Steppenwolf, who was a major criticism of why the first film sucks so much because he was just some motiveless CGI blobby baddie who's generically evil and wants to destroy the planet because reasons. He's far more interesting in Zack Snyder's version because he's given some backstory, he's fleshed out. Admittedly, I think his backstory they could have got a bit deeper with it because I wanted to know what he did exactly to piss off Darkseid. But he is way more interesting in this film because he's trying to prove himself to a higher power, and that just makes him more compelling. So there's a significant improvement in characterization all around in the Snyder Cut. And because Snyder isn't bound by time constraints, it's given him the freedom to expand and indulge his vision. And the result is a more consistent and coherent affair. It doesn't feel rushed, choppy, or disjointed like the Josstice League. It feels grand and epic. He really took his time to establish the players, the baddies, as well as the overall plot, which is mostly the same as the 2017 version. Steppenwolf is still looking for the 3 mother boxes so they can form a unity and he can destroy the planet. The difference is, though, that this film fleshes out the characters more, and there's also more world building. You can tell Snyder was definitely setting up plot threads for future DC movies with Darkseid, who is essentially the DCEU's equivalent of Thanos. I do think there was definitely some room for some editing. I don't think this film needed to be close to 4 hours long. I think they could have easily cut 20 to 30 minutes out of the runtime. I didn't need shots of cappuccinos being made, or scenes where Alfred is brewing cups of tea, or tracking shots of briefcases and flannel shirts. Oh, and you could have trimmed the bloody runtime down just by not indulging every action scene with excessive slow-mo. It really just pads out the runtime when you have so much of it in slow-mo. I definitely preferred Thomas Holkenberg's score to Danny Elfman's. It just suited the grim and grimy aesthetic of Zack Snyder's film better than the Danny Elfman version, which was more playful. But yeah, the motif for Wonder Woman, every time she was doing an action scene with the meow, That was a choice. Yeah, I thought that was a bit repetitive and a bit cheesy. And what was with all the Nick Cave songs in the soundtrack? As for other negatives, Amy Adams does technically have more to do in this version, but she still feels a bit wasted as Lois Lane. Also, Snyder wasn't even trying to be the least bit subtle with the product placement for Mercedes. It is beyond gratuitous. But the biggest issue that this film has is that it's trying to jam in the legwork of 3 prior solo superhero movies, as well as the collaborative ensemble team-up, all into one film. So it's a big movie. It's a lot. Like I said, I had to watch it in 2 sittings. I couldn't get all the way through it in one go. But I will say this, even though it's long, I wasn't bored. Like, I was entertained all the way through. It was just a lot to sit through. I think the best way to consume the Snyder Cut is to think of it as a cinematic odyssey, because you've got 6 chapters, a prologue, and an epilogue. And having chapters is good because it can tell you when you can go for a toilet break or have a biscuit. So let's ask them 3 questions. Firstly, would I watch this again? Yes. I mean, if and when I do come to revisit this film, I will need to set aside a big chunk of my day or my weekend in order to sit through it. But I had no intention of revisiting the Josstice League version. However, with Zack Snyder's cut, despite the runtime, I could definitely see myself revisiting it someday. Question number 2, do I recommend it for you guys? I know a lot of people will have their trepidations about watching this film given its runtime and if they didn't like the previous version of Justice League. However, I still think it's worth checking out, merely because of how fascinatingly different it does compare to the 2017 version. And as a film lover, comparing the 2 versions side by side is an experience in itself, which I think is worth experiencing. There's nothing like this that's ever happened before in terms of cinema. So I think it is worth checking out. However, it is long, it's hyper stylized, it's saturated in CGI, it's very Zack Snyder, and I know not everybody likes his style, so it's not going to be for everyone, this film. But if your curiosity is tickled, then give it a go. If you're not enjoying it after the first chapter, you can always turn it off. So yes, I do in fact recommend the Snyder Cut. And third and final question, what score would I give it out of 10? Zack Snyder's Justice League is without a doubt a much, much better film than Justice League 2017, and I'm so glad he got to see his film through the way that he envisioned it. Even though it might be bloated, it is consistent in tone and aesthetic, and it's also more emotionally effective. I also appreciate the ambition of what Zack Snyder was going for, and I think for the most, he does pull it off. The film still has its fair share of issues, but it didn't stop me from enjoying the film overall. And if he does get a chance to make a sequel to Justice League, I would be so down for it. So I'm going to give the Snyder Cut a score of 7 out of 10. Thanks so much for watching my review, guys. What did you guys think of the Snyder Cut? Let me know in the comments section down below. If you guys have enjoyed this video, hit that like button. If you want more movie, TV, and Oscars related content, don't forget to click subscribe, and if you want to follow me on social media, all those links in that video description down below. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching. For more things related to movies, TV, and popcorn culture, I'm Luke Airfield, and I'll see you next time.